The chair did not fit me. It never did. The council had designed Conclave Station with 47 species in mind, and apparently humans were the one footnote they had not bothered to measure. So I sat in a seat built for a Vethkai delegate, a creature with 3 knees and a spine that bent the wrong direction, and I listened to the most politely worded sentence I had ever heard in my life tell me that humanity was no longer considered capable of governing itself. The delegate reading the resolution was named Quethel. He had 4 eyes and a voice like wind through a pipe organ, and he spoke with the kind of calm that people use when they have already decided the argument is over. He did not look at me while he read. None of them did. 47 species sat in a curved chamber built to resemble the night sky of some planet none of them had actually come from, and they all found somewhere else to look while Quethel read Directive 7 Omnis into the record. My name is Mara Voss. I am 39 years old. I was born in a small town in northern England, and before I became Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council, I spent 11 years in the Royal Marines. I mention that not to impress anyone, but because it explains why I did not react when Quethel finished reading. Marines are trained to absorb information first and process it second, so I absorbed it, all of it. The words custodial world sat somewhere in my chest like a stone someone had dropped through still water. The words administrative committee of 5 species. The words 30 standard days. The words pending full compliance. Then Quethel set down his reader tablet and folded his hands, all 4 of them, and he looked at me for the first time. I asked him one question. I said, was this vote unanimous? He said it was. I thanked him. I stood up. The chair made a sound when I left it, some mechanical sigh of a thing designed for a body that was not mine, and I walked out of the chamber and down the long corridor that led to the human wing of Conclave Station. The corridor was lit in shifting amber and violet, the compromise lighting that the station designers had settled on because no single species agreed on what comfortable looked like. I had spent 2 years walking this corridor. I knew every seam in the floor panels. I passed the Vethkai delegation lounge and smelled something like burnt copper that meant their negotiators were inside. I passed the doorway of the Meyerland quarters and heard nothing, because Meyerlands were always silent. I passed the door that led to the observatory deck, which had the best view of the planet below, and I did not stop. I went to my office. I sat down. I looked at my desk for a long moment. On the desk was a photograph. It was not a digital frame or a projected image. It was a physical photograph printed on paper, because I am the kind of person who believes some things should have weight. The photograph showed my brother standing next to a piece of machinery so large the camera could only fit half of it in the frame. He was grinning. He had been grinning for most of his life, which I had always found both annoying and deeply reassuring. Beside the photograph was a cold cup of tea. I had made it before the session and forgotten it, which was unusual for me. I did not drink it. I opened my secure terminal. I typed a message that was exactly 1 sentence long. I had been hoping for 2 years that I would never have to send it, and now I sent it anyway. It said they voted yes. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of my office was plain gray composite, nothing remarkable about it, and I had stared at it enough times that I knew every variation in its texture. It was the kind of ceiling you look at when you are not really looking at anything, when you are actually looking at a problem from the inside and trying to find the shape of it. The problem had a very clear shape. The Galactic Council had just voted to place Earth under supervision. 5 species would form a committee. That committee would oversee human governance, human movement, human industry. Earth's military assets would be grounded. Human travel beyond designated corridors would require council approval. All of this was framed as temporary, as a response to what they called the Tyrant Incident, and all of it was scheduled to begin in 30 days. 30 days. I had worked in diplomacy long enough to know that 30 days is not a deadline. It is a test. It is the council watching to see what you do with the space they have left you, watching to see if you scramble, if you argue, if you beg. They expected negotiation. They expected appeals. They expected me to come back to the chamber with a legal brief and a list of grievances and a request for more time. What they did not know, because I had never told them, was that I had not been preparing a legal brief. I had been preparing something else entirely. I picked up the cold tea. I drank it. It tasted terrible. I thought about the photograph of my brother and his impossible grin, and I thought about the message I had just sent, and I thought about all the things that message was going to put into motion. Then I thought about Quethel, and how he had not looked at me during the reading, and how that was not disrespect. That was unease. Something in Quethel's 400-year-old political instincts had known enough to not look directly at the thing that was about to become a problem. I found that quietly satisfying. Back in the council chamber, I later learned, the Vethkai ambassador Quethel had leaned toward his chief aide after I left and said that the session had gone peacefully. His aide, a younger Vethkai named Salrin who had been studying humans for 6 years, had said nothing in response. Quethel had asked what was wrong. Salrin had said that the human ambassador had not blinked during the entire reading of the directive. Quethel considered this and said that he did not see why that was significant. Salrin said he was not sure either, but he was going to keep thinking about it. I wish I could have told Salrin that his instincts were correct. I wish I could have told him that the absence of a reaction is not the same thing as the absence of a plan, but he would find that out soon enough. Everyone would. I finished the terrible tea. I set the cup down. I opened a second terminal, an older one that was not connected to the station's main network, and I began to work. Outside my window, the planet Kepler 442b turned slowly in the dark. Below me, the stars did not move. They never did. They just waited, the way stars always do, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to what small creatures decided to do in the space between them. I had always liked that about stars. They did not negotiate. They simply burned. The first thing the council did not understand about humans is that we do not go quiet when we are afraid. We go quiet when we are thinking. There is a difference. Most species interpret silence as retreat, as submission, as the sound a creature makes when it has accepted its situation and begun the process of adjusting. The Vethkai go quiet when they grieve. The Meyerling go quiet when they are ill. The Korathi go quiet only when they are dead, and even then apparently their nervous system continues producing low-frequency vibrations for several days, which their priests consider sacred and their biologists consider inconvenient. Humans go quiet when they are building something. I had 14 days of quiet. I watched the council during those 14 days. I attended every session I was required to attend. I smiled at the right moments, nodded at the right moments, and said the minimum number of words required to maintain the appearance of normal diplomatic activity. The other ambassadors watched me with varying degrees of caution. Some were sympathetic. The Pelari ambassador, a soft-spoken woman named Irath whose people had gone through something similar 3 centuries ago, stopped me in the corridor on day 3 and said quietly that she was sorry, and that if there was anything she could do, she would try. I thanked her. I meant it. Irath was one of the few people on this station I genuinely liked. The Vethkai delegation watched me more carefully than anyone else. Salrin, the young aide who had noticed I did not blink, had apparently convinced Quethel that some additional observation was warranted. I noticed Salrin in the corridors more often than before. He was subtle about it, in the way that someone is subtle when they have studied subtlety, but have not yet had enough practice to make it invisible. I let him watch. There was nothing in my visible behavior to report. On day 5, I received a reply to the message I had sent on day 1. The reply was also one sentence. It said understood, proceeding. I deleted both messages from the terminal and went to make breakfast. What I need to explain now, because the Council never fully understood it even after everything that happened, is what humanity had been doing in space for the 60 years since we had first made contact with the galactic community. The Council assumed we had been learning. They assumed we had been trading, observing, slowly absorbing galactic culture, the way a new student absorbs the rules of a school. They had watched us build a few stations, establish a few colonies, send a few ships into the outer corridors, and they had nodded among themselves and decided that humanity was progressing at a reasonable rate for a young species. They were looking at the wrong thing. We were not building stations. We were building capacity. We were not establishing colonies. We were establishing positions. Every human structure in space for the last 60 years had been designed by people who asked one question before they asked any other question, and that question was, if everything goes wrong, what do we need this to become? My brother, whose name is George, understood this better than almost anyone. George was not a diplomat. George was an engineer, and engineers think in contingencies, in load-bearing limits, in the gap between what a structure is and what it could be made to do under pressure. He had been working on the outer installations for 4 years before the Council's vote. When my message reached him, he already knew what to do, because he had been doing it quietly for longer than anyone had formally asked him to. There were others like George, hundreds of them, thousands, actually, spread across every human installation from the inner solar system to the edge of the Kepler corridor. They were engineers and builders and logistics coordinators and supply chain architects, and they had all received some version of my message, and they had all responded the same way. They got to work. I did not tell the Council any of this. I continued to attend sessions. I continued to smile and nod. On day 8, the Council's administrative committee sent me a formal agenda for the transition proceedings, a 50-page document outlining the schedule for the handover of Earth's governance functions. I read every page. I filed a polite acknowledgement. I did not respond with objections. The lack of objections made the Council nervous in a way that objections would not have. Ambassador Irath found me in the station's common garden on day 9. The common garden was a circular room filled with plants from a dozen different worlds, which nobody tended particularly well, so most of them were technically alive but not exactly thriving. I was sitting on a bench near a cluster of something from the Korathi homeworld that smelled faintly of cinnamon. Irath sat beside me without asking, which I appreciated. She said, "You have not filed any counterarguments." I said no. She said, "The committee is interpreting that as acceptance." I said, "They are welcome to interpret it however they like." She looked at me for a long moment. Irath's eyes were pale green and very steady, the kind of eyes that had spent centuries watching political situations develop from their earliest stages. She said, "Mara, I have been in this work for a very long time. I know what acceptance looks like, and I know what it does not look like." I told her that I appreciated her concern. She said she was not sure concern was the right word. She said she had read everything her people had on record about human history, and that the part that kept coming back to her was the chapter on what humans did when they were told they could not cross an ocean. I asked what they did. She said they built better ships. I smiled at her. I could not help it. She was the sharpest mind on that station, and she had gotten there faster than anyone else. She stood up. She looked at the cinnamon-smelling plants for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, that she hoped whatever we had built was enough to make the Council reconsider without anyone having to find out what reconsideration refused looked like. I told her I hoped so too. Then I sat alone in the garden for a while and thought about George, and all the people like George, and the thing that was taking shape in the dark spaces between planets. On day 10, the Council's sensors detected an unusual concentration of activity in the outer asteroid belt. They filed a query with the human embassy asking for clarification. I replied that it was routine infrastructure maintenance. On day 12, a Meyerland science vessel that had been passing through the outer Sol corridor sent a report to the Council, noting that several human installations appeared to have changed configuration since their last recorded survey. The Council filed another query. I replied that infrastructure evolves. On day 13, Sauron stopped me in the corridor, not casually, directly. He stepped in front of me with the particular determination of someone who has decided that subtlety has not been producing results. He said, "Ambassador Voss, the Council is concerned about the activity in human space." I said, "I am aware. I have responded to both queries." He said, "The responses were not specific." I said, "The queries were not specific either." He looked at me with all four of his eyes, and I could see the calculation happening behind them. Sauron was not Quethel. Sauron had done his reading, and his reading had told him something that Quethel had not quite absorbed. He said, "What are you building out there?" I looked at him for a moment. He was young. He was perceptive. He had noticed things that his superior had missed. I said, "Sauron, in approximately 17 days, you are going to find out." I said it the way you say something that is both a promise and a warning, and then I walked past him, and he did not follow. That evening I received a third message from George. It did not have any text. It was just a single number, a percentage, and the number was 94. I sat with that number for a long time. 94%. In 17 days, the administrative committee would arrive to begin the transition proceedings. They would come expecting a planet preparing to cooperate. They were going to find something else entirely. I made a fresh cup of tea. This time I did not forget it. I sat at my desk, and I looked at the photograph of George and his grin, and I thought about what my old commanding officer used to say during training, when a situation looked hopeless and the obvious solution was not working. He used to say, "Stop looking for the door they locked. Start looking for the wall they forgot to watch." I had found the wall. 94%. 6 more days. The committee's lead vessel was called the Voice of Reason. I always thought that was either a very brave name for a ship or a very ironic one, and I was never quite sure which. It arrived at the outer edge of the Sol approach corridor on day 27, 3 days ahead of schedule, which told me that someone on the Council had finally gotten nervous enough to push for an early arrival. The Voice of Reason was a Vethkai vessel, large and elegantly designed in the way that Vethkai always designed things, all curved surfaces and deliberate symmetry. It was accompanied by 4 escort ships, one from each of the other administrative species. Together, they made an impressive convoy, the kind of arrival designed to communicate authority before anyone had to say a word. I was watching the sensor feed from the human embassy when they entered the corridor. I saw the exact moment they stopped. It was not a dramatic stop. The convoy did not reverse or scatter. It simply slowed and then held position, in the way that something slows when the person operating it is trying to process what they are seeing before they decide what to do next. I understood exactly what they were seeing. The outer Sol corridor had not been empty for 14 days. What had been empty space was now filled with debris. Not the chaotic debris of an accident, but orderly debris, cataloged and mapped, moving in predictable patterns, the kind of debris that accumulates around a construction site of extraordinary scale. Sensor tags and navigation markers floated among the material. Everything was documented, everything was charted, everything was perfectly safe to fly through if you knew the corridors. The committee convoy did not know the corridors. They requested a guide. I sent them one. I sent Lieutenant Commander Owen Price, who was 28 years old, absurdly competent, and had the specific gift of explaining complex things in a voice so calm that people felt reassured even when the content of what he was saying was not reassuring at all. Owen guided the convoy through the outer debris field at a careful speed. And as they moved through it, their sensors were building a picture of what lay beyond. They did not like the picture. The voice of reason requested an immediate communication with the human embassy. I was in the connection before the channel had finished opening. The committee's lead representative was a Vethkai administrator named Velhara, a senior official of considerable reputation, who had managed the custodial transitions of 3 other species over the past 2 centuries. Velhara had the particular manner of someone who is accustomed to having their authority recognized on sight, and the first thing Velhara said to me was not a greeting. Velhara said, "What is that?" I said, "Good morning. I hope the journey was comfortable." Velhara said, "Ambassador Voss, what is that structure?" I said, "Which one?" There was a pause. Velhara said, "The sensor returns indicate multiple large structures across the inner system. We are reading 12,000 discrete platform signatures. We are reading energy outputs inconsistent with what we have on record for human installations. We are reading navigational modifications to the outer corridor that were not filed with the Council." I said, "The corridor modifications were filed. I filed them on day 11. They may have been routed to the Infrastructure Subcommittee rather than the main Council record." Another pause. Velhara said, "What are those platforms?" And here is the moment I had been thinking about for 27 days. Not with anticipation, not with satisfaction, with the particular seriousness that comes when you have built something because you had to, not because you wanted to, and now it is time to explain it to the people who made the building necessary. I said, "They are called the Aegis Array. They are a distributed autonomous defense lattice, 12,000 platforms, seated across the inner solar system between the orbit of Venus and the outer edge of the asteroid belt. Each platform is individually limited in capability. Together they function as a single integrated system." Velhara said, "That is a military installation." I said, "That is a complicated question. It has no weapons in the traditional sense. It carries no projectiles, no directed energy emitters, no systems that function offensively. It is a sensor and response network. It detects, it tracks, it coordinates. What it does with that information depends on circumstances." Velhara said, "It is 12,000 platforms." I said, "Yes." Velhara said, "This was constructed in 27 days." I said, "No. The final assembly was completed in 27 days. The components have been in development for 6 years. The manufacturing was distributed across 43 facilities in the asteroid belt, the Martian orbital stations, and the Jovian infrastructure network. The final deployment sequence required human space to be, as you might say, motivated." The silence that followed was long enough that I checked the connection to make sure it had not dropped. Then Velhara said, "Where are Earth's civilians?" I said, 81% of Earth's off-world civilian population has relocated to habitats in the asteroid belt and the Jovian system over the past 27 days. The relocations were voluntary. The habitats are not within Earth's atmosphere and are therefore not subject to the residential provisions of Directive 7 Omnis. Another silence. I said, "I also want to note that the Aegis Array does not violate any provision of galactic law. I had our legal team review the full Council charter before deployment. There is no prohibition on distributed sensor networks. There is no prohibition on autonomous coordination systems that do not carry offensive armaments. The array is unusual. It is not illegal." Velhara said, "Ambassador Voss, I have managed 3 custodial transitions in my career. In each case, the species in question required between 6 months and 2 years to accept the administrative framework. You have done this in 27 days. I said, "We are a fast-moving people." Velhara said, "This is not a compliment I am paying you." I said, "I know." Another pause. Then Velhara said, "I need to consult with the committee." I said, "Of course. We will have a berth prepared for your ships at the inner station. I will have Lieutenant Commander Price guide you through." And Velhara said, "Yes." I said, "We also relocated 12,000 people from low Earth orbit facilities in the first 48 hours. If you check the directive text, low Earth orbit is technically categorized as an atmospheric boundary zone rather than a surface installation." I flagged that ambiguity in my acknowledgement on day one. I mentioned it would need clarification. There was no response for 4 full seconds. Then Velhara said, "You mentioned it would need clarification." I said, "In paragraph 3, the acknowledgement was filed with the administrative office." Velhara said, "Nobody reads acknowledgements." I said, "I know." I ended the channel and sat back in my chair. Owen Price appeared in my doorway 2 minutes later. He was holding a data tablet, and his expression was the carefully controlled expression of someone trying very hard not to let any particular feeling show on their face. I said, "How did they look coming through the debris field?" He said, "Slow." I said, "Good." He said, "The array is at 97% operational." I said, "George finished early." Owen said, "He says it is the best thing he has ever built. He also says he is going to sleep for a week after this." I said, "Tell him he gets 3 days." Owen allowed himself a small smile. Then he said, "What happens now?" I looked out the window at the inner system, at the scattered glitter that was 12,000 platforms moving in their slow, deliberate patterns, doing nothing, watching everything, the most patient thing humanity had ever constructed. I said, "Now they go back to the council, and the council has a very uncomfortable conversation, and then someone calls an emergency session." Owen said, "And then?" I said, "And then I go to the session and I explain some things that should have been explained a long time ago." I stood up. I straightened my jacket. The committee convoy was moving through the outer corridor now, guided carefully by Owen's staff, their sensors running continuously, their analysts doing the mathematics that happens when the thing in front of you does not match the projection you brought with you. I had one thing left to do before that session. I called George. He answered immediately, which told me he had not slept at all, and his grin was exactly the same as it had been in the photograph on my desk. He said, 97% and climbing. I said, "Well done." He said, "You knew they would come early." I said, "Velhara has a reputation for it." George said, "The debris field confused their navigation for about 11 minutes. Price's team had to guide them through at half speed." I said, "Good." George said, "Mara, do you think they understand yet?" I thought about Velhara's silence. I thought about Salrin noticing I had not blinked. I thought about Ireth and the ships in the ocean. I said, "Not yet, but they are starting to ask the right questions. That is the first step." George said, "What is the second step?" I said, "I go and give them the answers." George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the quieter voice he uses when he actually means something, "Be careful." I said, "I am always careful." He said, "No, you are always prepared. Those are different things." I sat with that for a second. Then I said he was right. Then I ended the call and picked up the stack of documents I had been building for 27 days and walked out of the human wing and toward the council chamber. And the corridor lights shifted from amber to violet around me, and the station hummed its quiet hum. And somewhere beyond the hull the Aegis array turned in the dark, patient and enormous, watching the space between the stars. The chamber was full. I had been to hundreds of council sessions. I had sat through trade negotiations, territorial disputes, scientific accords, and one remarkable occasion when two species had nearly come to conflict over the correct pronunciation of a shared astronomical designation. I knew what a full chamber looked like at normal capacity. This was not normal capacity. Every delegation had sent not just their ambassador, but their full advisory staff. The observation galleries above the main floor were occupied for the first time since I had taken this posting. The lighting in the chamber, usually set to the amber-violet compromise, had been shifted slightly cooler, which meant the station management had switched to their formal configuration, the one reserved for occasions of historic weight. I walked to the human delegation's position at the base of the curved floor. I did not hurry. I set my documents on the lectern. I looked up at 47 delegations and the galleries full of observers, and I thought about how strange it was that a room designed to look like a night sky always managed to feel like anything but open space. Velhara opened the session. The voice was controlled, but the packing was slightly faster than usual, which was the tell. Velhara spoke for 8 minutes, summarizing the situation in the Sol system, describing the Aegis array, noting the civilian relocation figures, referencing the asteroid belt manufacturing capacity that had apparently surprised everyone, including the analysts who were supposed to be tracking it. Velhara was careful not to characterize any of it as a violation. That was because Velhara's legal team had done the same review mine had, and arrived at the same conclusion. None of it was a violation. When Velhara finished, the floor opened for response. 7 delegations attempted to speak simultaneously, which set off the chamber's priority protocol, which none of them liked because it meant they had to wait. I stood at the lectern and waited with them. The first to speak was the Korathi lead delegate, a towering figure named Gret, who asked directly whether the Aegis array constituted a threat to galactic stability. Gret was not being hostile. Gret was being Korathi, which meant direct, precise, and genuinely curious. I said no. Gret said, 12,000 autonomous platforms covering the inner Sol system does not constitute a threat. I said, Gret, a locked door in your home is not a threat to your neighbor. It is information about what you consider worth protecting. The array tells you what we were prepared to do to keep what is ours. It does not tell you anything about our intentions toward anything that is yours. Gret sat back, not satisfied but thinking. The second delegate to speak was from the Salin Coalition, a species whose name I will not attempt to render in English because it requires 2 vocal registers simultaneously. Their concern was the manufacturing capacity. They had looked at what humanity had produced in 27 days of final assembly and done the extrapolation backward to estimate what our total industrial capability must be, and the number they had arrived at was considerably larger than the one they had on record. I said, yes, you were working from outdated figures. They asked how outdated. I said, the figures the Council has on record for human industrial capacity were compiled 9 years ago. Infrastructure grows, particularly when you have 60 years of practice and a strong motive to be self-sufficient. A murmur moved through the chamber, not alarm, something more careful than alarm, recognition. I let it settle. Then I said, I would like to address the full council directly, not the specific points raised by individual delegations. I would like to address the underlying question, which is the one no one has asked aloud yet. Velhara looked at me for a moment, then indicated that I should proceed. I took a breath. I said, 47 days ago, my people received a ruling from this body that described them as too unpredictable and too prone to error to govern themselves. The justification was the Tyrant incident. I want to address that incident, because I believe this body made a decision without having all the relevant information. I opened my documents. I pulled up the sensor logs from the Tyrant boundary zone, filed 8 months before the Council's vote, routed to the Infrastructure Subcommittee on arrival, never escalated to the main chamber. I said, The mining charge deployed during the Tyran incident was detonated in response to a Vethkai patrol vessel that crossed a marked boundary into a designated human extraction zone. I have the sensor logs. The boundary markers were active and transmitting. The patrol crossed them by 400 kilometers. The crew of the extraction team filed a report and used the only deterrent tool they had available, which was a directed demolition charge they had been carrying for planned work on the asteroid in question. The charge was aimed away from the patrol. Nobody was harmed. Nobody was meant to be harmed. They were signaling, not attacking. The chamber was very quiet. I said, the logs were filed with this council 8 months before the vote on Directive 7 Omnis. They were not reviewed. The vote proceeded on the basis of an incident report that described the detonation but not the context in which it occurred. I am not standing here to assign blame for that. Filing systems fail. Subcommittees get overwhelmed. These things happen. But I am standing here to say that this body made a decision that would have fundamentally altered the future of my species on the basis of incomplete information, and that matters. Quethel, who had not moved since I started speaking, said, Ambassador Voss, even granting the context you describe, the Council's concerns about human unpredictability extend beyond a single incident. I said, I know. And I want to address those concerns directly, because I think the word unpredictable is doing a great deal of work in this conversation that it cannot actually support. I said, what you call unpredictability, I call adaptability. And I want to explain the difference, because I think this council has been looking at human history and drawing the wrong conclusions from it. I paused for a moment. The chamber was silent. I had their attention in the specific way you have someone's attention when they are not sure what you are going to say next. I said, my species survived ice ages without tools you would recognize. We crossed oceans in wooden vessels using navigation systems that amounted to watching the stars and making careful guesses. We discovered nuclear physics 70 years before we left our own atmosphere, which many of you have taken as evidence of our dangerousness, but which I would ask you to look at differently. I said, we discovered it. We used it. We nearly destroyed ourselves with it. And then we spent the next century figuring out how to not destroy ourselves with it, and we largely succeeded, and we carried that knowledge into space with us. That is not the history of an unpredictable species. That is the history of a species that makes very large mistakes very quickly and then works very hard to understand those mistakes and do better. I said, you are afraid of us. I know that. I have known it since my first session in this chamber, and I want to tell you something about fear because humans understand fear better than almost any species I have studied. I said, the correct response to something you do not understand is not to contain it. The correct response is to understand it. Containment is a temporary measure. Understanding is permanent. What this council attempted with Directive 7 Omnis was containment, and I am telling you now, as directly and as respectfully as I can, that it would not have worked. Velhara said, on what basis do you make that statement? I said, on the basis of mathematics. Your own analysts ran the projections. I have a copy here, filed under Model 7B in the Council's internal research archive, dated 11 months ago. Another silence. Velhara looked at the chief analyst, who appeared to be deeply interested in the floor. I said, the model estimates a 74% probability of active resistance to custodial enforcement within 36 months. Full compliance probability at 3%. Those numbers are not a threat I am making. They are a description of human nature that your own researchers arrived at independently, and they are accurate, not because we are aggressive, but because we passed a law on Earth 200 years ago that says a government that surrenders its sovereignty without existential cause can be removed by the people it represents. Directive 7 Omnis would not have quieted Earth. It would have legally required us to resist you. The chamber remained silent for a very long time. I said, "So here is what I am asking. Not demanding. Asking. I am asking this council to review the Tyran incident logs that have been sitting in your subcommittee archive for 8 months. I am asking you to look at your own projections. I am asking you to reconsider Directive 7 Omnis not because we outmaneuvered you, which we did, but because the directive was based on a mistake, and this council is better than its mistakes." I said, "In return, I am asking for full membership, not provisional, not conditional, full membership with the same standing afforded to any species of equivalent development. I am also asking for a formal acknowledgement that the mining crew of Extraction Unit 14 was acting within established boundaries on the day of the Tyran incident. Because those 6 people have had that incident on their records for 2 years, and they deserve to have it corrected." I folded my documents. I said, "That is all I am asking for. I am not asking for compensation. I am not asking for an apology beyond the official record correction. I am asking to be treated as what we are, which is a young species making its way in a very large universe, doing our best with the tools we have, which are sometimes remarkable and sometimes terrible and always entirely our own." I looked at Quethel when I said that last part. Quethel looked back, all 4 eyes steady. I sat down. The session was suspended for deliberation. It lasted 4 hours. I sat in the small waiting room off the main corridor and drank another cup of tea, a better one this time, and listened to the station hum. When the session resumed, Velhara read the vote. 46 in favor of revoking Directive 7 Omnis and initiating full membership proceedings. 1 abstention. The abstention was from the Vethkai delegation. Not Quethel. Quethel voted in favor. The abstention was from Salrin, who technically did not have voting authority but had somehow submitted a record of non-participation that the system had accepted, probably because no one had thought to code a restriction on aides entering votes during a session of this particular type. I found this completely unremarkable and also strangely perfect. I sent George a message. It said 46-1. He replied immediately. He said, "What was the one?" I said, "Long story." He said, "We are still at 97%. I said, "Leave it." He said, "The array." I said, "Yes." He said, "Mara, the vote passed, we won." I sat for a moment with that word. Won. It was the right word and also the wrong word, in the way that words sometimes are when they are accurate but incomplete. I said, "George, we did not win. We avoided something. Those are different things, and the difference matters because the thing we avoided is still possible if we stop paying attention." George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So we leave the array." I said, "We leave the array." He said, "Understood." He ended the call. I sat alone in the small room off the main corridor, and I could hear through the wall the sound of the chamber returning to activity, 46 delegations processing what had just happened, and I thought about all the things that had been set in motion, and all the things that had been avoided, and all the things that would need to happen next, and I felt not triumphant but something quieter and more durable than triumph. I felt like the work was beginning. 6 months passed. In those 6 months, the Galactic Council completed the full membership proceedings for humanity. I attended every review session, signed every document, answered every question from every subcommittee with the same patience I had brought to the chamber on the day of the vote. The proceedings were detailed and sometimes tedious and occasionally insulting in their assumptions, and I completed all of them, because that is what membership costs, and the cost was worth paying. Dr. Enkecha Osai, who was the finest xenolinguist on Earth and had been working on Vethkai cultural studies for 3 years, formally opened the cultural exchange program with the Vethkai delegation 2 days after the vote. Irath, the Pelari ambassador, had quietly suggested the timing, correctly intuiting that an immediate gesture of good faith would matter more than a perfect gesture made later. HFY flew to Conclave Station from her research post near the Kepler belt, and she walked into the HFY cultural wing with a smile and a translation device, and enough patience to fill the entire corridor. And she sat down across from a HFY cultural officer named Ethra, and they began what would become, over the following months, one of the most productive cross-species academic partnerships in the Council's history. I mention HFY because what she found in the first 6 weeks of that exchange is the detail that still surprises me when I think about it. The HFY sacred site, the moon that the mining charge had cracked. Quethel's people had been mourning it for 2 years, had cited it as the central emotional justification for the vote, had described the damage in their testimony as an act of profound cultural violence. What HFY found, working with Ethra through the HFY sacred texts, was that the crack had healed. Not completely, not in any geological sense, but the impact had created a fracture pattern in the surface mineral layer that had, over 8 months, begun accumulating a crystalline formation in its fissure. The formation was slow-growing and pale blue and entirely beautiful, and the HFY high clergy had reviewed it and issued a formal declaration. They called it a mark of renewal after trial. They wanted to build a monument at the site, a joint monument representing both species. They had already sent a formal proposal to the human embassy, which had been sitting in my intake queue for 2 weeks because my intake queue was, at that point, significantly longer than any reasonable person could have anticipated. I read the proposal on a quiet Tuesday morning with a cup of tea that was exactly the right temperature. I approved it immediately and filed the response before I had finished the tea. I thought about the mining crew of Extraction Unit 14. I thought about the report being corrected on their records. I thought about the fact that they had been carrying a demolition charge for planned work on an asteroid and had used it in what they thought was a reasonable and measured response to a boundary violation, and that this had set in motion 2 years of the most consequential diplomatic crisis in human history, which had ended with a crystalline formation being declared sacred and a monument being planned. And I decided that the universe had a sense of humor that was very hard to predict. George sent me a photograph. It was similar to the one on my desk, but different in important ways. In the one on my desk, George is standing alone next to the machinery, and the machinery is so large the camera can only fit half of it in the frame, and he is grinning. In the new photograph, George and 7 of his team are standing in front of one of the Aegis platforms, and the platform is fully deployed, and they are all grinning, and someone has written something on a strip of metal and attached it to the base of the platform. The strip said, "Routine infrastructure." I laughed for approximately 30 seconds. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that catches you by surprise. Then I set the photograph beside the old one on my desk and looked at both of them for a while. The Aegis array was still at 97% operational. I had told George to leave it. The Council had not pushed back on that decision after the first query, which I had answered by nodding that the array did not violate galactic law, and that its continued presence served as an accurate representation of Earth's commitment to maintaining awareness of its own security. This was a diplomatic way of saying we had built it and we were keeping it, and the Council had accepted this answer with the particular dignity of people who have done the mathematics and decided not to push. Lieutenant Commander Owen Price had been promoted. I filed the commendation myself, which I almost never did directly, but Owen had guided a 5-ship Council convoy through a debris field at half speed and maintained perfect composure throughout, and that deserved recognition. He was embarrassed by the commendation in the specific way that very competent people are embarrassed when their competence is named out loud. I told him to get used to it. Irath stopped by my office on the morning of the formal membership ceremony. She brought a plant from her homeworld, a small thing with silver-green leaves that apparently required almost no maintenance, which she had correctly identified as the kind of gift I would actually keep alive. She set it on my windowsill and looked out at the view of Kepler 442b. She said, "You know, when your message reached this station 2 years ago, requesting an embassy posting, I voted against assigning you this sector." I said, "I did not know that." She said, "I thought you were too young, and I thought a former military officer would struggle with the diplomatic register. I thought you would be too direct." I said, "I am too direct." She said, "Yes, but it turns out that is sometimes exactly what a room full of people who have been too indirect for too long actually needs." I said, "I will try to take that as a compliment." She said, "It is one." She stayed for the ceremony. She sat in the gallery with the other ambassadors and watched as Mara Voss, age 39, formerly of the Royal Marines, currently of Earth, signed the documents that made humanity a full member of the Galactic Council. The ceremony was shorter than I expected and more moving than I anticipated, which is the opposite of how most ceremonies go in my experience. Quethel signed the counter documents from the Vethkai side. We shook hands afterward, a gesture he had clearly practiced because it did not come naturally to four-handed bilateral symmetry, but he executed it with dignity. Sauron stood behind him and watched. I caught Sauron's eye over Quethel's shoulder. He held my gaze for a moment, and then he did something I had not seen him do before. He nodded. Just once, a small deliberate motion, the kind of gesture that means I see you and I understand you now, or at least I understand you better than I did. I nodded back. The reception after the ceremony was long. 46 species had brought food and drink and cultural offerings of various kinds, some of which were edible by humans, and some of which very much were not. And I navigated the room for 2 hours shaking hands and making conversation and accepting congratulations that were genuine from some delegations and carefully diplomatic from others. The Korathi delegate Gret told me with complete sincerity that the Aegis array was a remarkable piece of engineering and asked for the manufacturing specifications. I told Gret that was a conversation we could have after a more formal foundation of trust had been established. Gret found this reasonable. The lone voice that had not voted in favor of the resolution was a small species called the Yethma, a group of about 400,000 individuals whose homeworld sat in a region of space that no other species had ever had strong interest in, and who participated in the council primarily through observation. Their delegate was a compact, still figure who had said almost nothing in the 2 years I had been at the station. The Yethma delegate approached me near the end of the reception. They moved through the crowd in a way that was very quiet, and I only noticed them when they were already beside me. They said in careful measured English that was clearly self-taught, "Ambassador Voss, I voted against your membership." I said, "I know." They said, "I did not vote against it because I believe Directive 7 Omnis was correct. I voted against it because I believe it was not enough." I looked at them, they looked back. They said, "I have read your history in its entirety, every available record. Your species has broken every boundary you were given. Every limit that was supposed to hold you has bent. Every time the universe has said that something cannot be done, you have found a way to do it anyway. And I am not sure the Galactic Council is old enough to understand what that means in the long run." They said, "You scare me, Ambassador Voss." The room was full of conversation and noise, and the particular low hum of 47 species all existing in one space. And in the middle of all of it there was a small quiet figure looking at me with the absolute seriousness of someone who has thought deeply about something and arrived at a conclusion they are not happy about. I thought about what to say. I did not think about it for very long. I said, "Good. That means you are paying attention, and you will find we are much easier to get along with when you are." They looked at me for another moment. Then they said, "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" I said, "Yes." They said, "It is not entirely reassuring." I said, "I know, but it is honest, and we find that honest and reassuring are sometimes two different things that move toward each other over time if you give them enough of it." The HFY delegate stood very still for a moment. Then they said, "How much time?" I said, "Depends on the species. We are still working on it ourselves." They were quiet for another moment. Then they turned and moved back through the crowd, steady and careful and thoughtful, and I watched them go. I stayed at the reception until the last delegation left, because that is the kind of thing you do when the occasion calls for it, and you want to make sure no one has to leave a room before the host. And when the last guests had finally gone, I sat down in one of the chairs and took off my formal shoes, which were not uncomfortable exactly, but had been on long enough. I sat in the quiet of the reception hall and looked at the empty chairs and the remains of food from 47 worlds and the lights that were dimming, now toward their evening setting. I thought about the Aegis array, still turning in the dark between planets. I thought about the monument they were going to build on the moon with the crack in it. I thought about HFY and Ethra and their translation devices and their patience. I thought about Ireth's plant on my windowsill. I thought about George and his grin. The universe is a very large place. It is older than anything I can comfortably hold in my mind, and it contains things that would make even the most experienced diplomat feel very small, and it moves according to rules that nobody has finished writing down yet. We had been here for 60 years. 60 years out of all the centuries this council had been meeting, all the history these species had accumulated, all the agreements and disputes and monuments and misunderstandings that had built this place into what it was. 60 years. We had built 12,000 platforms in that time, quietly, just in case. We had relocated 81% of an off-world civilian population in 27 days. We had walked into a room with 47 species and made our case without raising our voice, and we had been heard. And the HFY delegate was right to be cautious. I was not going to pretend otherwise. We were a species that broke limits and crossed oceans and split atoms and built things we had not been asked to build, and that was simultaneously our greatest strength, and the thing most likely to make the rest of the universe deeply uneasy for some time to come. The honest answer to "Are you dangerous?" was, "It depends on what you do with us." The honest answer to "Are you trustworthy?" was, "We are trying. We have always been trying. We are very, very good at trying." I put my shoes back on. I stood up. I turned off the lights. I walked back down the amber-violet corridor toward the human wing, and the station hummed around me. And somewhere far out in the dark, the Aegis array completed another slow rotation, patient and enormous, and watching the space between the stars. We were full members now. The work was just beginning. And we were very good at work.